Ask most people when we discovered the first planet outside our solar system, and if they know anything about it at all, they'll tell you 1995. A hot Jupiter called 51 Pegasi b, orbiting a perfectly ordinary sun-like star, that discovery won a Nobel Prize. It's the one in the textbooks. It kicked off the entire field of exoplanet astronomy. It was not the first. 3 years earlier, in 1992, an astronomer named Alexander Volschan found planets somewhere nobody was looking, because nobody thought there could be planets there. He wasn't hunting for other worlds at all. He was doing pulsar timing, watching the metronomic pulses of a dead star and noticing that they were arriving a fraction of a millisecond off schedule, in a pattern that repeated. Something was tugging on the corpse. Several somethings, actually. Working backwards from the timing wobbles, he found 2 planets, and later a third, real worlds, with masses measured in multiples of Earth's, orbiting a neutron star. The first planets humanity ever detected beyond our own solar system are orbiting the burned-out remnant of a star that exploded. And here's what makes that genuinely strange, rather than just a piece of trivia. Those planets should not exist. A supernova is not a gentle event. When the star that made this pulsar detonated, it would have blasted away or vaporized anything already in orbit. Planets that were there before are gone, which means these formed afterward, out of the wreckage. In the most hostile environment we know of, something built worlds. And that's the thing I want to explore, because I think it's the most underappreciated fact about these objects. We tend to treat a neutron star as an endpoint, the full stop at the end of a star's sentence. It isn't. A neutron star is one of the most active things in the universe. It reaches out, it cooks, strips, shreds, and devours the things around it, and then, sometimes, assembles new things from the debris. It's not a corpse so much as a predator with a very long reach. So here's the plan. I'm going to show you what a neutron star actually does to everything in its neighborhood: the reach, the feeding, the destruction. And I want you to hold that opening question in the back of your mind the whole way, because every single one of those processes is a clue. By the time we get to the end, you'll have all the pieces you need to work out where those impossible planets came from, and the answer is grimmer than you're expecting. It starts with the fact that a neutron star doesn't really have a surface so much as a domain. Where does a neutron star end? The obvious answer is the crust, the solid surface, 20-odd kilometers across. But functionally, that's not the boundary that matters. The thing that governs everything around a neutron star is its magnetic field, and that field extends outward enormously. Picture it spinning. The magnetic field is locked to the star, so it spins too, sweeping around like the arms of a whirling dancer. But there's a hard limit, and it's a beautiful one. The further out you go, the faster the field lines have to move to keep up with the rotation. Eventually, you reach a radius where keeping up would require moving at the speed of light. That boundary is called the light cylinder, and beyond it, the field simply cannot corrotate anymore. It breaks open, streaming outward instead of looping back. For a fast pulsar, that boundary might sit a few thousand kilometers out, so the star's real domain is hundreds of times bigger than its body. And at that edge, the field flings out a relentless stream of charged particles accelerated to nearly the speed of light. This is the pulsar wind, and it is not like the gentle solar wind that gives Earth auroras. It's a relativistic torrent of matter and energy pouring out continuously for millions of years, powered by the star's rotation slowly bleeding away. And that wind builds monuments. In 1054 AD, Chinese astronomers recorded a new star bright enough to see in daylight for weeks. What they saw was a supernova, and what it left behind is the Crab Nebula, that shredded, glowing tangle you've seen in Hubble images. Here's the part that's easy to miss. The Crab Nebula isn't glowing from leftover heat, and it isn't just debris coasting outward. It's lit. At its center sits the neutron star, spinning 30 times a second, and the wind screaming off it is energizing the entire nebula, causing it to shine across the electromagnetic spectrum. A star died 1,000 years ago, and its corpse has been floodlighting its own wreckage ever since. That nebula would have faded long ago if the dead thing at the center weren't still feeding it. So that's what a neutron star does to empty space. Now let's talk about what it does when there's something nearby, because that's where it stops being impressive and starts being genuinely horrifying. A great many neutron stars have companions, and if that companion is close enough, the neutron star's gravity starts stripping gas off it, pulling a stream of stolen material off the surface of a living star. That material can't fall straight in because it has angular momentum, so it spirals, forming a hot, flattened disk. And hot is doing enormous work in that sentence. As material spirals inward, friction and compression heat it to millions of degrees, hot enough that the disk glows in X-rays. This is what an X-ray binary is: a neutron star sitting at the center of a whirlpool of stolen gas so hot it's shining in a part of the spectrum our atmosphere blocks entirely. We only found these things once we started putting telescopes above the atmosphere. Then the stolen gas actually lands. And what happens next is my favorite piece of neutron star physics that almost nobody talks about. The hydrogen and helium piles up on the surface, compressed by that unbelievable gravity into a layer. And as it accumulates, the pressure and temperature at the base of that layer climb, until they cross a threshold, and the whole layer ignites. Not gradually, in a thermonuclear runaway that engulfs the entire surface of the star in seconds. It's called a Type 1 X-ray burst, and it is effectively a star-sized hydrogen bomb detonating across the whole surface of an object the size of a city. In a few seconds, one of these bursts releases something comparable to what our sun emits in a week or two, and then it settles down, and gas keeps accumulating, and hours or days later it happens again. Some of these systems have been doing this on a rough schedule for as long as we've been watching. There are objects out there that periodically set their entire surface on fire, over and over, forever. And the companion doesn't get off lightly either. Which brings us to my favorite named objects in astronomy, because whoever came up with these names knew exactly what they were doing. Some millisecond pulsars have very close, very small companions, and the pulsar's wind, that relativistic blast we talked about, slams into the companion star continuously. It heats the facing side to thousands of degrees hotter than the far side. It blows material off the companion's surface and out of the system. The pulsar is, slowly and literally, evaporating its partner. Astronomers call these black widow pulsars after the spider that eats its mate. And the name is earned. In these systems, the companion has been whittled down to a fraction of the mass of our sun, sometimes to less than the mass of Jupiter. There's a closely related class with slightly heftier surviving companions, delightfully named redbacks after another spider with similar habits. Collectively, the field calls them spider pulsars. Now connect two things. In a previous video, I talked about how millisecond pulsars get their absurd spin. They're recycled, spun up by matter stolen from a companion. So the sequence is, The neutron star feeds on its companion, and the meal spins it up to hundreds of rotations per second. And the faster it spins, the more powerful its wind becomes. And that wind then destroys the very companion that fed it. The heaviest neutron star we've measured is a black widow, a pulsar spinning over 700 times a second, weighing in around 2.35 times the mass of the Sun. It got that heavy by eating. Its companion is a husk, and the leading explanation for why we see so many isolated millisecond pulsars, fast-spinning ones with no companion at all, which shouldn't exist if spin-up requires a partner, is that some of them finished the job. The companion isn't gone missing. The companion is gone. I find that genuinely unsettling in a way most astronomy isn't. It's not a collision or an explosion. It's slow. Something got close to a dead star, kept it alive, and was consumed by degrees over hundreds of millions of years. Which finally takes us back to the planets, because now you have the ingredients to understand where they might have come from. Remember the problem. The planets around a pulsar must have formed after the supernova from something. And there are two leading candidate stories, and they're both a little grim. One is a fallback disk, and I want you to actually picture this one, because it's a strange and rather beautiful scene. The supernova goes off. Most of the star is flung outward at thousands of kilometers a second and never comes back. But not all of it makes escape velocity. Some fraction of that material, the innermost, slowest layers, stalls out. It slows, hangs, turns over, and begins to fall back toward the newborn neutron star at the center. Ash, raining back down onto the thing that made it. It doesn't land, though. It's got sideways motion, so instead of falling straight in, it swings past and settles into a flattened, swirling disk around the star, a ring of pulverized stellar debris still glowing, orbiting the corpse. And now look at what you've got. A dense, rotating disk of dust and gas around a compact central object. Because that is precisely, in every way that matters to physics, the same starting condition as a newborn star surrounded by its protoplanetary disk. It's the setup our own solar system began with 4.5 billion years ago. So the same thing happens. Grains of dust drift into each other and stick. Clumps grow into pebbles, pebbles into boulders, boulders into bodies big enough to pull in their neighbors by gravity. The ordinary, patient, universal process of planet building runs to completion, just with the ashes of a dead star instead of the raw material of a new one. Same machine, different fuel. The other candidate is more direct. The disrupted remains of a companion star. If a neutron star tears a partner apart, the endgame of a black widow system, or a merger of some kind, the shredded material can end up in exactly the same kind of disk, and that disk can make planets too. Either way, the story is the same shape. Those first exoplanets we ever detected are quite likely built from the remains of something that died, made of a supernova's leftovers, or of a star that got too close. Recycled matter, assembled into worlds by an object that had already destroyed everything it originally had. And what a place they must be. Those planets orbit a neutron star, which means their sky has no sun in it, just a pinprick and a wash of radiation. There is no meaningful visible light. Their surfaces are bathed in the pulsar's particle wind and high-energy radiation. They're worlds in perpetual, sterile darkness, orbiting a lighthouse that emits almost nothing useful. There's an even stranger one out there, by the way. In a globular cluster called M4, there's a planet orbiting a pulsar white dwarf pair that's been nicknamed Methuselah because it's estimated at roughly 12.5 billion years old, nearly 3 times the age of Earth, formed when the universe itself was young. a gas giant that has been circling dead and dying stars since before our solar system existed. Which is the point I want to land on, because I think it changes what these objects are. We call them dead stars. It's a natural phrase and it's misleading. Death in the ordinary sense means inertness, an ending, a thing that stops doing. A neutron star does not stop doing anything. It floodlights nebulae for 1,000 years. It reaches out and pulls a living star apart, thread by thread, over geological time. It builds a whirlpool of stolen gas and heats it until it glows in X-rays. It sets its own surface on fire on a schedule. It evaporates its companions until there's nothing left. And then, in the debris of everything it has consumed and everything that made it, it apparently assembles planets. The first worlds we ever found beyond our own solar system are orbiting one of these, and they were probably made from a corpse, either the star that exploded or the star that got too close. We looked out into the galaxy for the first time, searching for other planets, and the first ones we found were in a graveyard built out of the dead.